Hey everyone, welcome to this exciting panel that we have for you today. So today, with some esteemed guests, we're going to be exploring eIDAS 2, the fact that it's coming, that hopefully most of us know about. So we'll explore some of the context for that and how we, in the opinions of the guests, this is going to change ID verification for all of us. So thanks to all the audience for kind of joining us as well. And of course, for those of you watching this as a recording also. My guest today, and they'll be speaking fairly soon, we're privileged to be joined by Gail Hodges. So Gail is the Exec Director at the OpenID Foundation. And because she's always super busy, she's also the special advisor of identity technologies at the California Department of Motor Vehicles. Gail is from the US, has obviously a global view, but she'll potentially give this is a good kind of US perspective on things. And in contrast to that, Marcel, as we'll find out as well, is kind of based in the Netherlands and in Europe and has been involved in this space for many, many years. Marcel is the CTO and founder of Digidentity, and he's also part of a consortia. It's members of the EU Digital Wallet Consortium, also abbreviated to eWS. And I'm Nick Lambert, I'm the CEO of DOC, and I am the moderator for this session. The structure today is going to be a live panel, followed by audience Q&A. So we've got some questions and topics to explore. But as you listen and there's things that spring to mind or maybe questions that you had before the event, please feel free to add them into Riverside, which is the web app that you're using to view this on. And behind the scenes, our head of content, Francisco, will package up the questions and share them with us. And we'll ask those at the end of the panel session as well. So hopefully get to each one of your questions in time. And like I say, please note if we are recording this, like I said, so if you have registered, and we will send this to you after the event as well by email, so it will be available on demand for you. So the purpose or the whole subject of eIDAS is something that many will be familiar with, but just in case you've been living under a rock somewhere for the last couple of years, the focus of eIDAS is to provide a framework for secure electronic identification really throughout Europe, and also obviously facilitating verification as well. And with the approval of eIDAS, which happened, eIDAS 2, which happened very recently, they reckon about 400 million EU citizens will soon have the ability to have interoperable identity wallets containing credentials issued by their nation states or their governments. In terms of the deadlines that we're looking at, I know this probably to many seems quite a long way away, but given how slow technology can move in terms of rolling it out at scale, and also the speed that large organizations such as governments move, we're working to a deadline of around about September 2026. And that's the deadline at which EU member states must deliver a EUD wallet to their citizens. And it's also where trusted service providers need to be able to start being able to use these credentials within their verification platforms if you're a large entity. And the whole hope is by 2030, we'll see around 80% of EU citizens and companies actively using this technology under the eIDAS 2.0 standards. So a lot to unpack there and a lot going on. So if I might start the kind of panel itself, and maybe I can start with you, Gail, if I may. So the question is, what new use cases will eIDAS and the EU Digital Wallet enable from your perspective?
Yeah, so they're focused on, well, first of all, thank you for having us, Nick, for this conversation. Looking forward to it today. I have my coffee nearby. I'm treating this as a coffee chat, right? So very social amongst us and the group listening in. But the use cases, I know they have 11 official use cases, and they include some of the obvious ones like age over X, right, for age-restricted purchases and opening a bank account, as well as mobile driving licenses. So there's like a few standard use cases in there. But they have been narrow, right? So they're focusing on the 11. They're using using the large-scale pilots to kind of flesh out those use cases and to be able to demonstrate them. But there are some that aren't there yet, which I think will be interesting to explore. So there's, over time, after that probably December date, they'll be thinking about these more, but use cases like emergency services, like how to support individuals with restricted access to emergency areas, and people that have been in an emergency, like how to help them through that crisis, and also cross-border use cases. So I think they've been very ambitious by selecting 11 to pursue all at the same time, but there will be other use cases I'm excited to see come out of the process as well.
Fantastic, thank you, Gail. And yes, coffee is very much a requirement, particularly when you're in the US and it's pretty early in your day. So absolutely. And Marcel, and Marcel, from your perspective then as well, I mean, business processes, obviously the obvious ones that we'd think about are cross-border stuff, maybe accessing government services. Are there any others that you're particularly excited about that you see that there's a focus on?
Yeah. So first of all, also thank you for having us at the nice event again. So I think a lot of use cases we are already doing today will migrate to the wallet, and for example, proof of qualifications, and don't mean your basic school or university diplomas, where what is in one of the 11 use cases that they are testing in Europe, but really work-related qualifications. So, for example, in the automotive aftermarket, there's already legislation in Europe called SERMI, Secure Repair and Maintenance Information, where you need to prove as a mechanic that you are not a criminal, that you have your qualifications to work on a vehicle. In Australia, you see that with ASRA, with MVIS, and also in the US with the National Automotive Service Task Force, NASTAF, that they need to fit and proper proof that the mechanic is allowed to work, for example, on an electrical vehicle, because it's very dangerous if you don't have the qualifications. And these are, I think, great use cases with the wallet, because it's more frequently used. It's used on a daily basis, and it can prove really at that moment. So luckily, we are the sole credential provider for Europe, so we will have a great business case there. But I think that kind of this is then the automotive aftermarket, but there are a lot more markets where you need really work-related qualifications to prove on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's an interesting use case, Marcel. I wasn't familiar with that one. Do you think there's too many? Like Gail, I got the sense maybe that it's ambitious, like you said. Do you think it's good to be ambitious and to really show the potential of like this wallet technology and eIDAS 2 standards, and to show like all of these possible things that can happen? Or do you think that's potentially a negative angle to really trying to do too much at once and potentially miss the mark?
I fully support the European Commission and their strategy under the architectural reference framework and their diligence to flesh out those first 11 use cases. So yeah, I do think it's ambitious, but they also have this somewhat longer time horizon and very rigorous structure of enabling the large scale pilots, where each of the pilots has selected use cases that they would like to focus on. So I think they have put in place a rigorous structure to get real substantive focus on those use cases and to prove them out. So I think it's fair, right? If they try to do, even more use cases, like say 50 use cases, that could be, really a struggle. But it seems logical to me. I can talk about some other work on the global context, but I don't think for, let's say, global cross-border interoperability, we do 11. That feels like a little too much. We probably would do a smaller set.
Yeah, definitely. One of the really interesting aspects that we have with this technology is that it can be, it makes data portable, and obviously then it can be used with other sets of data. So I think most people that are involved in this space would be dismayed to think that this would only be a wallet that's used for government use cases, for example. So if all of this ends up being just a wallet where we interact with the government for government services, I think that'd be a huge letdown for many and a very big missed opportunity. And of course, once we start to combine this with data held privately by organizations and combining it potentially, or enabling wallet holders to combine it with data that they have from government sources, that's where it gets really, really interesting. So do you think that organizations are taking the opportunity to kind of link what will be government-backed credentials with maybe credentials that they create as well? Are you starting to see an appetite for that, Marcel?
Yes, absolutely. And these companies are not knocking on our door, but banging on our door. Because if you look to verifiable credential, if you really can combine that with the PID, so the personal identity data that's issued by government, or even taking from a driving license, from an MDL in this case, then every verifiable credential will be so much more valuable. Look at, for example, UBO check, so the ultimate beneficial ownership, what you need to prove as when you have a platform, you need to prove to companies who the ultimate beneficial owner is. And that refers to the natural person who is ultimately responsible for owning or controlling the entity. And this makes so more valuable what they can prove really easy. I think the UBO use case is a very strong one in these business organizations. Especially for the platforms like an Amazon, that kind of things, they need to prove this. Which companies are they dealing on their behalf? Because they're selling it on their behalf. So they need to prove that for the financial transparency.
Yeah, very good, Marcel. And do you have a perspective on that, Gail, as well? I know you wear many hats and the various roles that you do. Are you starting to see that composability, I guess, of verifiable credential data and how it's being applied by organizations?
From my personal vantage point, I'm not yet seeing that many use cases where different verifiable credentials are being combined together. There's so much focus on getting the initial issuance of the credentials out the door, as well as the initial use cases enabled for acceptance, that it's kind of like a second order problem. But I think from a theoretical perspective, like there's definitely a lot of appetite to be able to start combining those credentials. Right, so Marcel was giving the example of a qualification for a mechanic, right? Being able to say, here's the PID, here's this underlying credential from the government, here's this qualification, combine that together with maybe the particular university claim of which university is that from? Like, how do you combine these different claims together to enable a more complex use case like employment? I think that's really, really exciting, but you won't see at least I don't think employment is one of the critical path items that they're on, but I think that's where the art of the possible is, right? Where you take these microeconomic small scale transactions and turn them into fundamentally changing people's lives. Like that's very exciting. So I think we'll see more of that, but as the standards are maturing on how to link those credentials together with confidence and how we see the PID credentials, those personal identity credentials, linking more closely with entity identity and entity assertions. That's another key area that we need to see maturity in order to get those more complex use cases to roll. I would say that there is, one area that is both concerning to me, but also an interesting opportunity. You mentioned Amazon, so I'll just use them as an example. You can have a government issued credential, and then you can have what I refer to as a derived credential. So like another entity that's trying to create an identity off of something based on government credentials. So today you'll see services that are using, let's say, physical credentials, scanning the front and back of a card, doing liveness, doing a facial, biometric check, and then creating maybe a particular proofing evidence, that they can offer and monetize and add with other signals in order to help with proofing, let's say for bank accounts or for other use cases. So those exist today, but the ability to be able to consume a government issued digital credential could make that type of service even more valuable. But the question is that service going to keep checking back that the government credential hasn't been revoked or had a change of status on it? And so the derived credential could be very interesting and could further explode the use cases and the adoption, but there has to be there are no guardrails around that yet. Right? So the European approach will have guardrails around the issuance of the government credentials, but what about any derived credentials that get created on the back of them? How do you make sure that those also would have the guardrails, would be fit for purpose, and would address things like revocation?
That's a really interesting point, Gail. Who would you see kind of owning that then? Is that something where you'd expect governments to regulate, or is that industry that's going to need to make sure? Because of course, the negative of what you're describing there is you basically have identity data that's based on something that no longer is the case, and obviously that can lead to huge numbers of problems. So would you see that there's any one party that needs to actually step up and in time put in place regulations that mandate how identity that's built on top of other credentials, how that's managed?
I think we'd have different answers to your question depending on where you are in the world, Nick, right?
Okay.
So if you're in Europe, like the answer might be, oh, perhaps that's an expansion to the regulation. Like, would they try and incorporate that in the current rounds because they're actively pursuing, gathering feedback on that regulation now? I'm not sure that would be a critical area of focus at the moment. Again, because there's so much of an emphasis on the initial issuance, the initial presentation, and so forth. But I do think it's an area for caution for all governments to contemplate, even the possibility of derived credentials, and for there to be public-private collaboration to think about what good looks like. Couldn't tell you whether that comes through the standards layer, whether that comes through the policy layer. It's just something that's kind of on the horizon, which feels like inevitably it will come. And how do we anticipate it and try and, as a community, try and mitigate any of those risks?
Yeah. So the kind of message I'm getting, Gail, is we need to run before we can walk, is basically where we're at just now. I'm sorry for putting so much on you. I expected you to know everything, so I want all these answers. I need you to look into the future, Gail, and tell me what's going to happen, but probably unfair of me to put all of that onto you. Marcel, you said an interesting thing a minute ago where you were talking about we're asking the question around composability of data, and you made the comment that you actually see organizations not just having a demand for this, but kind of beating the door down. And so are you starting to see within Digidentity, the company that you're the CTO for, are you starting to see much more commercial demand for in and around eIDAS within the EU, it sounds like?
Yeah, and that's I'm normally not so positive about EU pilot projects, but in this case, the relying parties are part of the projects. So they really want to have this, some want to have this as live as soon as possible. And we still need to figure out a couple of technical issues to solve that. But really, as the moment they can go live with it, they want to go live because like the UBO check, it makes their lives so much easier because that's a huge cost for these companies today, and that can be so much easier and much more reliable. So that's why they wanted to have it as soon as possible. And there are plenty of use cases popping up on a weekly basis that could be a potential for the wallets because it really makes it. If you have to structure the basic layer very good, so that we're using the standards like the OpenID standards now, W3C and the ISO standards. If we all comply to that, we have a really good basic where we can build a huge identity platform on top of it.
Yeah, very good. That's good to hear. I think one thing as well as we start to see these credentials start to being used more than they are right now, which is probably not obviously very much. We're going to see a lot of new commercial opportunities. So I see this as distinct from the use cases that we spoke about at the start. But when we start to see this happen at scale with the use of government credentials and obviously potentially private ones issued by commercial organizations as well, what are the commercial opportunities and business models that you're excited about? If I put that to you first, Marcel.
Yeah, for us, today we are qualified to a service provider and an identity provider delivering identities on level high. So for us, it's really the QAAs and the EAA, so the electronic attestation of attributes and the qualified version of it, to issue that for third parties. That can be consumed by every wallet. And that will, for us, a really focus point. New use cases. But today we do only qualified signatures, but that will be then a lot of qualified attributes. What we're going to deliver on behalf of other parties that they want to deliver that to other wallets.
Yeah. So that's someone proving that they've signed a legal agreement, for example, Marcel.
Yeah, that's today. But then the attributes that you want to have, for example, you're a mechanic that can work on an electrical vehicle. That needs to be that qualification needs to be translated into verifiable credential, and electronic attestation of attributes, and that needs to be signed. And as a qualified service provider, we are able to do that.
Very good.
On behalf of an institute that delivers these certifications.
And you could quite easily imagine that use case transferring itself well into other areas. So you might have a mechanic, but then you maybe have a tradesperson, professional services, of course, like with really high stakes there as well. You could really see how that
doctors, nurses.
Exactly. Yeah, interesting. Gail, what are you seeing on your travels in the market? What are the commercial opportunities that are exciting you just now?
So obviously for this podcast, I'm speaking on behalf of the OpenID Foundation. So I see a little bit of a spectrum, across participants in the market, although I myself am not focused on like developing and pursuing those opportunities. I do see a lot of competition on the issuance side amongst established players or some new entrants that are trying to help the governments with the issuing of the credentials or offering those proofing and liveness pieces of functionality to help with the issuance of the initial credentials for the government entities. Or obviously interesting to hear from Marcel on the educational certificates or employment certificates. Like there can be a range of different issuers of different types of credentials that could be presented through the wallet. So there's definitely a lot of activity going on there. But I think where I'm the most interested is seeing how the relying party community, all of those merchants, all of those banks, all of those government entities, how they can consume them. The analogy that I would give is a little bit like web developers. Right? When the internet was rolling out, you had a lot of people who were saying, oh, I understand how to build a website and let me help you build a website and I'll help you build a website and you build a website. Like I'd like to see that cottage industry growing up around the acceptance of these verifiable credentials or acceptance of these mobile driving licenses across all of the different potential consumers of those credentials. So we're just at the very, very beginning of that journey. And I think there's a huge potential, right, for the college students, to jump in and like help support their local community to consume those credentials. So I'd really love to see that area exploding. And there will be some that do it at scale. There will be existing players who update, let's say, the Carrefour infrastructure to accept, a digital identity credential to prove age or to collect packages. Things like that will happen through maybe more established players and consultancy firms and technical providers. But, getting that long tail of entities accepting credentials, I think would be really, really super.
Yeah, thanks for that. On that question then Gail raised about kind of educational stuff, Marcel, is that something that's maybe it didn't sound like is that a focus for you in the consortium project that you're working in just now? Is that something that you're starting to see?
No, not in the consortium project, but that's because it's already our daily business. So for CERMI, for example, the automotive aftermarket, we have identified all the doctors in the UK, and we will start a new project now for NHS based on wallets. So that's already a daily business, and that's easy to transfer directly to verifiable credentials as well.
And in that use case, Marcel, is that the case where doctors are able to either work privately or to work within other NHS trusts or other parts of the UK, for example, to enable them
Correct.
to quickly verify? Is that what that's for?
Yeah,
okay.
Because it takes them now 3 days to move to another hospital to prove again who they are.
Yeah, and of course, a huge amount of medical time that's lost in doing that as well.
Yeah.
How much? Yeah, no, that's a great use case, and so that's something that's just starting to start to gain some traction now, Marcel, and that's a new project.
Yeah.
Okay. And talking about business models, that was part of that question as well. Like it seems that the industry has been slower than maybe many of us who work in the industry and are looking for it to grow more quickly. It's maybe been a little bit slower to take off than many would have hoped. And I wonder if in part that's down to the business model being a little bit confused in terms of, to get these markets started, you need credentials to exist, and therefore you need somebody to start issuing credentials. But without a financial, at least, incentive for those credentials to be issued, it definitely has been what we've called in the past a cold start problem. Is that something that you guys have experienced? And are you seeing new business models develop that get around those types of issues? And Gail, I don't know if you've got a perspective on that.
I see a range of different approaches around the world on how the cold start problem is being solved. Typically, you're seeing more government-led approach, right? Where there's a recognition that identity credentials are a public good, and therefore to kind of kickstart the transition from a physical credential to a digital credential, that a government has an outsized role to assist with that process and to help develop the ecosystem so the flywheel it develops in place, and then it can kind of continue to scale of its own volition. So in certain jurisdictions, like in a Nigeria or a Morocco or in Ethiopia or in India or Singapore, or here in our discussion with the EU, there's more of that kind of centralized focus to kind of develop and invest in the ecosystem as a whole. In other markets, like I'd say pretty much in different parts of Canada and the US, maybe a bit in Australia, are seeing more private sector leadership, developing kind of commercial ecosystems. Like Australia has Connect ID as an identity ecosystem. The US, you're seeing the Apple, Google, Samsung wallets with the issuance of credentials in partnership with the states. But there's not some huge grants, right, that have come to kind of help sustain those models in the US or in Australia. So there's a couple different models of government-led, private sector-led approaches that we're seeing to seed that market and to kind of address the cold start problem. In the US context, I think that's a gap, right? I think the lack of national strategy and the lack of national investment is a material issue. But after just leaving Fed ID last week, it seems unlikely that there's going to be a massive shift and a national strategy will emerge, certainly given the current election cycle and so forth. It's probably not going to be an area of concentrated focus. Maybe we'll be surprised, and the congressional legislation that's been poised to get through Congress will get that last vote it needed to pass both the Senate and the House, but we're not there just yet.
The only one I was aware of, Gail, was Department of Homeland Security. Obviously, Anil John he seems to be everywhere in this industry and a great advocate for this technology. And I see that group has certainly done a lot of funding, and I think there's 5 key areas that they're looking for funding. But I certainly haven't been aware from this side of the pond, at least, of any others. So it sounds like that's your read on it as well.
Well, quite a bit. I mean, there's a tribe, right? There's a tribe of people that are doing the doing in the federal entities, and Anil John is one. There are different parts of the DHS, like the TSA is also enabling the acceptance of those mobile driving licenses. In NIST, they're very focused on the revision to 863-4, which will provide the digital identity guidance, and which will include things like the new mobile driving license credentials and new verifiable credentials will probably be included in more depth in their guidance, which will allow federal entities to start consuming them. And those are just a few examples, right? So there are quite a few subject matter experts that are moving things along the best that they can in the absence of White House leadership, in the absence of congressional funding of any material scale. And of course, that then means that the states are driving more of the conversation in the US and driving more of the investment as they take digital, the driving licenses and convert them into mobile driving licenses. So I can't remember how many we're up to now, but it's like about 8 to 10 different states now have programs live to issue mobile driving licenses, which is quite exciting. But that's not all of them in one go like we have in Europe with that top-down leadership.
Yeah, thank you for that, Gail. And how are you seeing that in Europe, Marcel, in terms of maybe the mix of the blend of commercial activity from private entities and how they're able to or able not to fund this new technology coming through, and also versus some of the EU funding? I mean, you're much closer to that than I am. I know that some of the EU work will certainly partner you up. I'm not really aware that there's a lot of necessarily large funding opportunities that exist for private organizations, at least. But what are you seeing?
Yeah, so there's not much funding, and also in the EU, you get a 50% funding, and the other 50% you need to pay yourself. But I was really excited to go into this because next Monday it's 16 years ago that I founded this company, this beautiful company, and we've bringing already the reusable digital identities to a lot of people, to millions of people on a daily basis. And I feel responsible for the 100 colleagues that I have that still need to pay the mortgage after 5 years, that we need to transform our company and look into new business models, because there will be a lot of changes. Every European member will have a free QES, a qualified certificate to sign documents. That's one of our business cases today, where we earn money on, and everybody has one for free. So we really need to disrupt ourselves to be still valuable in the future. And I think that's why we stepped in quite early, in the early days already. I think we're already investigating this a couple of years now, to be prepared for the new wave and to deliver a good wallet, a good ecosystem, what we have today.
Yeah, I think that's really good to hear as well, because I think as well, if you can get a sustainable business, it is by its nature obviously sustainable. It can keep going. If something's existing purely, it needs to be kick-started, maybe on funding grants and what have you, but that's obviously not sustainable in itself. So it's encouraging that companies are obviously looking for repeat recurring revenue that can enable their business to sustain itself over a period of time.
Yeah, but also the funny thing is to add on that is we struggled a lot the last 16 years to explain what a reusable digital identity is. And now we call it a wallet, and everybody understands what it is. And suddenly the whole concept is clear for everybody. So that helps us a lot.
You needed the market to catch up, Marcel, it sounded like, and help that education for you. And also congrats on the 16 years for Digidentity. I wasn't aware of that time frame, so congrats for that. So moving back into, we'll have a legacy period then as we start to think about these new types of credentials and ID documentation coming online. There will be this kind of probably quite a prolonged transition phase where there's going to be a combination. Obviously, all the hard copy stuff just doesn't disappear overnight. How do you think it will, Gail, at first, how do you think this will affect ID providers relying currently heavily on traditional paper-based ID verification?
You mean the companies that offer the traditional plastic and paper?
Exactly. It's that difficult transition. They're really focused on paper and cards today. What's the impact going to be like for them?
I mean, I think the players that I'm familiar with and that I've observed, so there's the very large players like IDEMIAs and Thales, GND and so forth, HID, many of these players have been focused on digital identity for years and years, right? Thinking about being in the forefront, participating in the standards development very, very actively, like the ISO standards, and some of them also in the OpenID Foundation or the W3C, et cetera. So they're very active participants in the domain space. I think they recognize that if they don't innovate and stay current with all the new technologies and understand how to make it work for them, then they can be left behind, because there's relatively easy substitution for new providers who focus only on the digital issuance of credentials to be selected by governments, for example, where they've had a historical dominant share, and they could lose that business to new entrants, right? And in the long distant future, that could be a challenge for them. Now, at the same time, I think there's been some issues where I'll pick on IDEMIA. I think that at one stage they believed that they might be able to monetize the transition to digital in a really substantial way, and that didn't kind of come to fruition the way that they might have hoped. And so I think it's an interesting inflection point, because we're talking about that public good that has historically, created this pretty complex and expensive physical credential, turning into a more standardized way of issuing and presenting a digital version of that credential, where as long as one can build to those required standards, again, much more competition to participate in supporting government issuers. And the cost of acceptance has always been zero, right? If you're consuming a passport, you're consuming a driving license, unless you're doing additional checks, like the physical presentation of that document has never had a fee. So introducing a fee to the acceptance of the digital presentation of the credential is a very steep slope to address. So you're kind of in a situation with a fight to the bottom, right? Where there's not necessarily going to be a clear fee for the presentation of those digital credentials unless there's additional services added on top of that, right? But the generic presentation, like that cottage industry approach where you can just kind of consume it, you don't need to pay an intermediary a fee for that transaction. So I think that's going to be very disruptive to the industry as a whole. What it will look like, when you do have something that's digital and free competing with other paid services.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Marcel, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that in terms of that difficult transition for companies moving from hard copy or physical things into the digital realm?
Yeah, depending on which side of the pond you are. So on the side of the companies that deliver that today or consume it today. So my feeling of our approach is still that consuming this digital identity will be free, like they do today when they see a copy of your passport or you see the real passport or driving license, it's for free. And I think it should stay the same in the wallet. By the way, if it's a real decentralized identity, we as identity or wallet provider have no idea to whom you are showing this. So there is no transaction possible. But we're running here in the Netherlands and especially a business identity framework with 6 identity providers and 1 million identities in it. And that's pure business related. That's business with government, business to business. And they are happy to pay for it. So to initiate that into your wallet, they're happy to pay for it, want to make the business life much easier. And the side product is a citizen identity in your wallet. So that's a side product. We need to shift our focus on earning the money as a company on really the parts that are willing to pay for it. And then as a side product, you have a citizen's identity that can be used for free.
Very good point. And then so shifting them back to the US, if we can. Obviously, eIDAS is initially a European thing. I think there'll be implications elsewhere and globally, Gail. But how are you seeing the eIDAS 2 coming in September 2026? How are you seeing that impact the US and then more and globally as well? What are you thinking is some of the key differences or the key impacts that it's going to have?
Yeah, it's having a profound impact, and I'm not sure everyone would see the different layers of the impact. So I think I'll start with the standards. There's a lot of impact in the conversation of what's happening amongst the standards bodies. And then there's a lot of impact, I think, on different jurisdictions who've had infrastructure that might not have been standardized, like how they're thinking about it. And then there's the US. I'm going to come at it that way. So from a standards perspective, clearly the EU architectural reference framework is building on standards, right? It's using the ISO 18013-5 for the physical presentation. It's using OpenID for verifiable presentation for the online presentation component. And it has some specific credential types that are being defined, the MDocs and SDJOT that they're pursuing. So that's an important starting point, right? They're being very, very clear around what the architecture is to allow for the interoperability across Europe, and having a consultative process, iterative consultative process to mature that model. So that alone is major, right? So you have this entire region who's defining an architecture and saying everyone in this region under this regulatory requirement are going to need to conform to this same architecture and set of standards. But it's also not just one. They're allowing for some variability and some flexibility in there to serve different use cases. But it's also not infinite, right? It's not every possible standard and option that's out there. The kind of knock-on implications for the standards body has been some kind of pressure back and forth between the standards bodies, which often take quite a long time to mature their standards, and the EU need to kind of have mature standards in place in line with their issuance timeframe, the 2026 date that you mentioned. So some of the standards were already quite mature, like the 18013-5, but some of the more detailed standards, like in the OpenID Foundation, have not been as mature. And so there's been this very robust iterative process to try and continue to close any of the remaining gaps. So there are, robust implementers drafts and trying to take things into final in a timely manner so that everything is kind of fit for purpose. So there's that kind of closing gaps piece of the puzzle. And then there's also a lot of interest in Europe to make sure that they're, in fact, one could even say the entirety of the European Digital Wallet Program is to ensure that there isn't a duopoly of wallets globally, right, to avert a Apple and Google dominated wallet environment where the combination of their control of the, or let's say outsized influence on the browser piece of the equation, outsized influence on the app store, and the device influence through the kind of entire tech stack of device ownership and presentation online, that they could use that that footprint that they already have and use that to control the wallets. And that would be very uncomfortable for many governments to have private entities be in between them and their relationship with their residents or their citizens in their jurisdiction. And so having that kind of wedge in between, again, very uncomfortable. So you could look at the entire European project to say, we want to make sure that there's not just an Apple and a Google wallet that's a choice for our residents. We want to make sure that they have a government issued credential as a choice. And so that's having knock-on effects to the strategies of the big digital platforms, who obviously would like to have their wallets made available in Europe and in other parts of the world, and would like to ensure that their browsers can consume their own wallets, but also now there's that pressure to ensure that state-issued wallets, whether they're from Europe or from Nigeria or from California or wherever, that there can be that wallet selection. So what we've seen over the last 6 to 18 months is a lot of transition of very strong positions of key players where they had initial strategies and those strategies started to shift. So now you're seeing more interoperability between the platforms. You're seeing more ability for having wallet selection, credential selection features, and in forums like the IIW, the Internet Identity Workshop in San Francisco, there's been a lot of presentations and discussions around how to solve for the needs of wallets that are both government issued and private sector issued, and how to make that a fair playing field. So that encourages me a great deal, because it was something which was concerning to me and concerning to many players in the market, that there might not be this fair playing field. So I think that work of Europe is super important. In addition, you're seeing some of the other countries like India, huge footprint, right, using a model which is not based on global standards because it predates it. Singapore, same thing, right? Nigeria, the same thing. Many, many countries have rolled out digital identity infrastructure that hasn't been built on those open standards in the same way. But they are very interested in interoperability with their regional partners, their neighbors, global stakeholders, because of course people cross borders and trade crosses borders. So it's simply not possible for those countries to stay isolated with their own unique tech stacks and assume that every country is going to build the interfaces, back to, every single other country, right? It doesn't work. So we're seeing many of those countries like India, like Singapore, like Nigeria and Ethiopia and others, as well as the providers that support them, leaning in to figure out how do we enable that interoperability across borders. So that's something I think that's pretty cool, to see that implication of Europe, right? In Europe is one way, maybe using some of those open standards, things like OpenID Foundation standards could be some of the interfaces between different markets. So that you're seeing that knock on from Europe as well to prompt that conversation of how to do cross-border. And then I think, last but not least, US is, you see California's model is actually very similar to Europe, right? The architecture reference framework, the approach is pretty comparable. So I think that's another example where you're seeing echoes of the European model.
Yeah, some level of influence there. Thanks, a really, really good answer, and lots of information and detail in there. And I know that you've privileged to have a kind of really global outlook on this from some of your different roles. So that was really interesting to hear. Marcel, going back to you, so we've talked a lot about all of the stuff that's happening. There certainly seems to be a sense of something really big building, lots of use cases, lots of commercial opportunities, consortia and things like that developing at pace. What can businesses do to prepare for the inevitable rollout? So maybe that's a very vague thing to ask you. So maybe from a perspective of a relying party or a verifier that's going to have to use these credentials to verify some piece of information, what do they need to be thinking about right now to try and make sure that they're going to be in good position to capitalize when this technology gains mass adoption?
Yeah, they really need to prepare for it, because everybody is forgetting one thing. Is now it's called a relying party in the normal OpenID Connect and SAML frameworks. So they can trust the package that they get from our identity provider. They can trust that package. But now they are called verifiers, and they get a package from a mobile app. and they can't trust it anymore. So they need to verify if the data is still the original data. So they need to do a couple of things extra on their side. So they really need to be prepared for it. And I think they need to act now, at least to see what that will mean for them to do that transition. And that's why I also I had a talk about that in Berlin at the EIC Congress, hybrid wallets. We are going to build a hybrid wallet to deliver both the OpenID Connect thing as the verifiable credential, the OpenID for VC or VP, because the end user will not know what it is, the underlying technology. So I really promote hybrid wallets that can do the same thing, depending on the QR code you read. The app will decide how the underlying technology will act, and don't tell the user how to act because they have no clue what underlying technology is. But the relying parties in this case need to prepare for it.
I think that's maybe when you get to a point where something truly is usable, when actually the user doesn't need to know or even care what's going on under the hood. They just have this great user experience, and all the technical stuff is abstracted away from them as well. And Gail, like, do you think companies should wait? I mean, like, 2 years is a long time, right? But I guess like one of the other issues is maybe it's not so easy to start integrating either processes or systems into existing legacy systems. What's your perspective? If we were sitting 2 years away now, do you have a thought as to how quickly some of these companies should be acting?
So if we start with the European countries, right, like the relying parties that might be in Europe, the way that I usually advise it is some percentage of your team, right, should be thinking about it already, right? Maybe if you're a super small mom and pop shop, perhaps not, right? But if you're, any small, medium size or larger entity, you should probably already have a small team, could be 1, 2, 3 people that are, in that R&D mode, researching, playing around, becoming familiar with it, right? Helping to educate and inform others so that they can anticipate and start to, demonstrate some of the use cases, right? The standards are in a place where they can start to consume them. They can start to build, use cases for acceptance of those credentials and demonstrate to their senior leadership how that would work. In other jurisdictions, like in California, which is already live, I mentioned they have an architectural reference framework that's kind of similar to Europe, but they're live. So there's already the opportunity to consume. So if you're a global entity, or even an entity that happens to operate in the US, you could be trying to build to that model and taking advantage of the tools that are available to confirm that you can consume stuff from California, and then update that to be turned on, if you will, in your European markets. So some of the larger players can use their global footprint to, I call it the chocolate box, right? Like have different implementations in different places and like make sure that you're preparing for that transition to a much more digital identity enabled future.
Yeah, and Marcel, before we turn to kind of audience questions, do you have a perspective on that in terms of, do you think it maybe is dependent upon the level of involvement or the size of company as to how quickly they start getting themselves prepared for eIDAS 2?
Yeah, absolutely. When because of our long history, we've seen a lot of especially we do a lot with governments, both UK and Dutch governments, and there we see struggling at the larger departments with a lot of legacy to do this transition. And smaller departments don't have the budget, so it's both sides will struggling with or legacy systems or budget to do the translation. So it's really, and I think there for some companies that's a new territory of to help them to make this transition.
Yeah,
and therefore again, the hybrid wallet is, in my opinion, the best thing, because then also the relying parties moving to verifiers can do their own pace. As long as it's for the end user, it doesn't matter which QR code is scanned. And that's my biggest concern, QR codes, because we're teaching the whole world, don't click that link, but we have no idea what kind of link is behind that QR code.
Yeah, it's a very good point. So we should move to some audience questions now, and thank you for those that are kind of listening in and adding them here. So the first one that is put in front of me is from Rish, who says, in the EU, we're saying that the member nations would have to have their own EUDI wallets, even if the underlying tech is provided by someone else. The question is, or can players like Apple and Google, etc., still maintain their separate wallets that could hold citizen credentials? So I wonder if that question is about the interoperability of Google and Apple wallets with eIDAS credentials. Do you guys have a thought on that? Do you think that they're going to, I think we know the answer, but are they going to play in that space, Marcel?
I think they do, as long as they comply with the standards, and they will be crazy not to.
Yeah.
They will pick up part of the market. If they do every business case, I don't know. Especially with qualified signing, there's a liability as well. So I'm not sure if they're happy to take that liability. But we're always talking about Apple and Google. I'm more afraid of Microsoft. They already have a wallet. It's not compliant yet. They have LinkedIn, so they know where you work and you know your work history. They have a lot of credentials to issue in this wallet.
Yeah, and also they have their kind of Active Directories plugged into it as well, don't they? And the Authenticator, there used to be the Authenticator only app, also
Microsoft
transitioned
Entra,
into a wallet and Entra ID, exactly. Yeah. I also think that I remember from the EIC conference that you mentioned in Berlin, Marcel, I think one of the participants in the German wallet competition is partly as Google are in there as well. So yeah, I definitely think we'll see them in there as well. Okay, next question is from, I think, Yanis. What are the key uncertainties in eIDAS 2.0 that need to be clarified before the member states should offer the EUDI wallets to create ecosystems? Gail, do you have some thoughts? I know that there's been various things snuck in about security certificates and stuff and concerns with those. But do you have any other uncertainties that you have around eIDAS 2.0 that you think need clarification?
I think one chapter is what will be the kind of final conformance criteria, right? What will be required? So I think there was an annex to the recent Architectural Reference Framework 1.4 where they started to talk about certification and conformance. But I think that conversation, for obvious reasons, hasn't matured fully yet, right? Because we're not quite at the point where everybody would need to certify, right? They're, again, very focused on the issuance, very focused on making sure there's technical acceptance. And so some of the aspects of certification and conformance are still being developed. So I think that's one area that, from the OpenID Foundation perspective, could be important because we might act to be of service, to the European community as we are to other open banking and open data communities to help them with certification to our standards. We may be called upon to collaborate with the European Commission, and we'd be more than happy to do that to help the ecosystem participants to confirm their conformance. But I think what we have learned over time is that if you do not have very firm certification and conformance processes, then your interoperability will simply not work by default, right? So to give you some analogies, right, that the Visa and MasterCard ecosystems for decades have had scheme rules to ensure that all participants in those ecosystems are kind of annually updating, that they're conformant to the scheme rules, and therefore it just works for the end consumers and the end businesses. But that's because of those scheme rules ensuring that everyone is making gradual updates to the security platforms, to new product features like NFC rolling out, things like that. And the same is true for open banking and open data. We see the difference when there are more clear requirements for certification and conformance versus where there's not, and where you see the scale, right? You really need that certification and conformance to see the rollout really succeed across an entire ecosystem. So you mentioned, Nick, we're kind of in this, cold start phase, right? For any ecosystem like this that's being spun up, it's absolutely critical to have the certification and conformance.
Excellent. Thank you, Gail. And Marcel, do you have any kind of additional thoughts on that? You're obviously heavily involved in wallets and things, so you'll maybe be right in the front line of seeing some of these uncertainties with regards to the reference frameworks.
Yeah, but I really agree with Gail to have these standards. I think why GovUK Verify was a success, they pulled the plug, but it was a success because we had standards. We had the GPT-45 standards, and everybody was audited against it, and therefore it works. And that needs to be done on a bigger scale now. So these standards and auditing is really important for this.
I guess the hard part there is standards just take time because you're really obviously trying to get something that's very well considered, and also getting the input from lots of different types of organizations, and that just takes time. And so I guess there's that constant battle against getting something that's considered and will stand you in good stead in years to come versus the kind of timelines that are already imposed by the EU.
Yeah, and the EU looks like one organization, but it isn't. So now we get, after the eIDAS law is accepted, but now we get the implementing acts, and every member state can change the implementing acts on their side a little bit. So we need to be aligned there that it's still working all together.
Yeah, got it. No easy answers, it doesn't sound like. The next question from, I think I'm going to pronounce it as Mia, and apologies if I've made a mess of pronouncing your name. The question there is, the use cases discussed here in part, I guess, cover physical persons and obviously individuals. Will eIDAS 2 cover the credentials issued to companies' enterprises? So I guess kind of KYB and identification of companies. Whoever wants to take that, please jump in.
You want to go first, Marcel?
I can go in there. Yeah. It's 100%. So, and everybody seems to forget that. But if you look to the eIDAS law, it's really both a personal and natural persons as legal persons. So there will be legal PIDs, LPIDs. And that will be probably cloud-based wallets. And then, in how I see it, because we do a business identity already for a couple of years now in the ecosystem, that the end user will still have a wallet, and his authorizations or her authorizations will be in the wallet, what he can do on behalf of the company, but it will be issued from a company wallet, so that can handle their identities. Probably these company wallets, in my opinion, needs to be Scheme 2.0 compatible, so you can connect it to the rest of your infrastructure in the company. But it also will have your ISO certification. So if you work on a tender, you can deliver your ISO 27001 certification directly as a verifiable credential, that kind of things. But that's a big beast. Legal person wallets. That's a huge one. For natural persons, is really to understand you have a wallet in your phone and that's it. But for the companies, that will be growing the next couple of years.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I think Marcel has an excellent answer. And so I'll speak to a little bit more from the global perspective, which is that I know GLIFE, the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, whose focus has historically been on financial institutions since it was developed after the 2007-2008 financial crisis. G20 said, okay, now we need to have more transparency on who the entities are and the beneficial owners of those bank entities. So we have more transparency on the financial system as a whole. So GLIFE was created and has oversight of financial regulators from around the world. So that transition of having LEIs or legal entity identifiers, and then that model might be picked up for other types of entity identification and linking that back to the local jurisdiction that has set up that specific identity. And then they also have ambitions for that to then cascade down to the various employees that have been authorized individuals, whether they're kind of board members with signing authority or operating individuals with signing authority, or whether they are rank and file members of the organization. So there's an entire kind of ecosystem and area of challenge on that entity side, which I think the EU is trying to lean in to address as part of the scope, as Marcel's referencing. But there's that then whole global conversation as well, right? So use cases for supply chain or use cases for the supply chain of code, you're only going to be able to address those at global scale when you have a global mechanism for linking the entities of businesses to their employees and allowing for that both sides of the equation, the natural person as well as the business.
Very good. Very good. And it's nice as well, we can kind of round things out. I know we're out of time right now, and I don't want to take liberties with your time. You're both very, very busy, and I really appreciate you spending the hour with us discussing these really interesting topics. So we'll probably conclude it there. Thank you very much, Gail, and also Marcel, for joining us. I learned a lot as well, and hopefully you as the audience got a lot from it as well. We will email this episode out once it's been edited, and we'll send that over to you. And I very much appreciate you guys joining us. So thank you very much both for your time. And if you asked a question that we didn't quite get to, we'll probably try and answer it in some way in social media. So we have those questions there. We will not forget about you and we'll try and get back to you. But thanks very much, and we'll wrap things up here.
Great. Thank you for having us.
You're welcome.
Thank you.